Chile's worst unrest in decades that began last month in protest to a government plan to increase subway fares has now transformed into a nationwide uprising for change. There are few signs that protests will die down even after President Sebastián Piñera reshuffled one-third of his cabinet on October the 29th. Demonstrators are refusing to leave the streets because of their deep-seated frustrations with corruption, unfair economic and political systems. But what is the solution to the crisis? Can the nationwide protests reshape Chile's political landscape? And where is the country headed to? These questions and more in tonight's debate. But first, we have a background report for you.
There's no end in sight to the crisis in Chile, as one of Latin America's most prosperous and politically stable countries is being rocked by protests and looting amid a reckoning over inequality. The unrest originally sparked against fare hikes in public transportation in the capital Santiago, but turned into a general wrath on President Sebastián Piñera and the military across the country. Most rallies since October 7 have turned violent, with protesters attacking and destroying public and private property, including metro stations as well as supermarkets. That forced authorities to declare a state of emergency, while President Piñera personally tasked the military with containing the violence, looting and arson attacks in the streets. In an effort to quell the protest, President Piñera decided to reshuffle one-third of his cabinet. The move has failed to appease protesters. As a result, anti-government protests continued, with demonstrators demanding the resignation of the president himself. So far, weeks of violence have left nearly 2,000 people dead and hundreds more injured. Law enforcement agencies have also made thousands of arrests. The turmoil has forced the South American nation to cancel the upcoming Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit and a UN climate change meeting, with President Piñera saying the country at the moment needs to focus on restoring law and order and pushing through a new social plan. For decades, Chile and many other Latin American countries have been working in tandem with U.S. economic policies and applying strategies set by international financial organizations, including the IMF. Recently, similar protests gripped Ecuador after its government decided to end decades-old fuel subsidies. Does it mean the failure of economic policies on the part of these governments?
Ecuador, Peru, Haiti, Haiti. There is also protests going on in Honduras and Colombia as well. In all of these cases, they have followed the Western consensus, the Washington consensus, which is IMF austerity, neoliberalism, which means addressing capitalist crisis by pushing the burden onto the poor and letting the rich go by under the name of free market capitalism. The model that's crumbling right now in Chile is the model they're trying to impose in countries around the world that are creating an independent economy.
The scenes of violent protest against social and economic inequality and a political structure whose constitution is seen as a legacy of Augusto Pinochet dictatorship are striking in a country that has long been described as an exemplar of economic and political stability in a turbulent region. It seems that such instances of public agony and anger in Chile could have ripple effect across the region.
Well, joining us on tonight's debate, we have political commentator and Latin America expert Laho Sazdi joining us from San Juan, and also we have Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York, that is Danny Shaw, joining us from New York. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Sazdi in San Juan. Why are there mass protests in Chile right now?
Well, because of the great inequality that the Chilean economy has organically, structurally. It's a country that is very rich in resources, in trade, minerals, agriculture, but they haven't been able to distribute to try to make it easier for lower classes to climb up the ladder and to have social mobility upwards. And then there was, of course, the trigger for the explosion, the social explosion. The government of Piñera decided to increase the fare for the metro system, and well, the people couldn't cope. Just a brief example, according to Spanish TV, the news, the normal salary, I think monthly salary, will be equivalent in euros to 600 euros. But if you want to rent an apartment with 2 rooms, I believe that's what they said, in Santiago, the capital, it costs per month 550 euros. So there you have a picture of how difficult it is for those who are, let's say, I wouldn't say just at the bottom, because what I heard from a good friend, she's a successful businesswoman in Chile, she told me that the people who earn well earn very well, but the rest, not so.
Danny Shaw, how did the subway fare hikes, so small in scale, being less than half a dollar, lead to what we're seeing now?
Yeah, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. And, Mr. Sosdi in San Juan really summed it up well. The Chilean people, millions, really millions in a country of 18 million. We've seen millions of people in the streets, the largest demonstrations since 1990 when Pinochet was finally out of power. The Chilean people are sending a resounding message that they don't want to tweak the system, they want to overthrow the system of neoliberalism, of capitalist, imperialist pillage. And they're inspiring the rest of not just Latin America, but the world. We see Bolivia with Evo Morales in his re-election stronger than ever. Uruguay is headed back to a center-left candidate. And of course, very significantly in Argentina on Sunday, Macri was defeated. So that was a massive victory. So we see a huge leftward turn across Latin America.
Mr. Sosdi, let's talk about the Chilean President Sebastián Piñera's concessions, which included a package of social reforms and a partial cabinet reshuffle. Why didn't it satisfy the protesters?
Well, probably because they lack confidence and trust in the traditional political classes. Of course, one could say, well, let's give the government the benefit of the doubt, but perhaps, well, we have seen a situation of decades since democracy came back that, well, there hasn't been much change. We have also seen presidents that Michelle Bachelet, she's a socialist, but she married, well, her party went along with neoliberalism, not uncommon to what happens to the social democracy or the socialists in Europe, like in the case of Spain, in the case of Greece, in the case of Germany. So it's a phenomenon that socialist, moderate socialist parties go along with the neoliberal rules of the game, of the economic game, and that goes with together alongside with inequality. So probably that would be a reason. I would say the majority of the people don't trust the government and they want a radical change. Of course, there may be other forces playing along. My suspicion, using, well, recurring to open sources intelligence analysis, which I do, I would suspect that probably, but I cannot prove it, the violent groups that hijacked the protest of October 18th, you know, like 41 metro stations burned or vandalized, the supermarket burned, 3 people killed, a factory that was burned, 5 bodies found inside, the Enel, I think, electricity building burned too. I suspect there may be members of international anarchist network that they want to cause chaos. Of course, anarchy is opposed to any state, any government, any borders, any money, any market. So, and that probably is what led, but of course I don't know, the government to bring the soldiers to the streets. I don't think they brought the soldiers job because they want to oppress the people, but because perhaps their intelligence units, they detected something afoot that needed that. Of course, the people see the soldiers and it reminds them to the dictatorship, to Pinochet, the repression, etc. But we have to be careful too. The legitimate demands of the people must be fulfilled. Even the CIA World Factbook said in the economic section of Chile that of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development member countries, Chile is the one with the greatest amount of poverty. So there are things that have to be done, but there are other forces that may like to fish in troubled waters, and that makes the thing more complicated.
Danny Shaw, despite Congress passing a bill to freeze electricity prices, the protesters showed no sign of backing down, and the list of grievances against Chile's free market economic system is growing. Do Chileans still feel that the unpopular private system is a hangover from the country's military dictatorship, and now they're getting a chance to really oppose it?
Yeah, the 1973 to 1990 Pinochet dictatorship definitely left a legacy of social trauma in Chile. Some 80,000 Chileans detained for their political beliefs and activism, tens of thousands tortured, tens of thousands of others killed. And it's clear that what Mike Pompeo and Trump and the rest of the ruling class of the United States, that's what they want. They want to return to the Pinochet era of the free market, of neoliberalism, and the Chilean people have stood up. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few days and weeks. Of course, massive uprisings in Haiti right now are rocking that country. And Haiti in 1804 was at the vanguard of revolution and change across the hemisphere. And again, there we see Haiti. We see the Colombian government cracking down with stiff repression against indigenous activists. In Chile, we see cross sections of the people rising up, women's rights activists, the Mapuche people, the indigenous people, workers, students, the elderly fighting for their pensions, the working class. So it's clear that these protests are going to continue very strong.
Well, Sazdi, speaking of major changes, another problem that Chile is facing right now is that the political class there has lost a lot of credibility. A survey conducted in May this year found that the Senate, the Chamber of Deputies, and the political parties were among the country's 4 least trusted institutions. What's your response to that?
Well, yes, I wouldn't be surprised. And well, there are like some inherent problems in the structure, the political, social structure, not only of Chile, of many Spanish American countries, I suspect in Brazil too. And what I see is that, but that's my opinion, that there were this social class of Spanish descendants, European blood, white, merchant classes, patricians, aristocracy during the times of the Spanish Empire. And then some of their leaders wanted to have the panhandle. They wanted to control their regions, their provinces, their viceroyalties, and not the King of Spain, not the Spaniards in Madrid. They became independent, but for what? So that they would dominate the others, and they would keep their privileges, and they wouldn't allow anybody really, except if will be some foreigner, white migrants coming from abroad, like many French immigrants that came to Chile, that will be all right, or British. But the Indians, for instance, the Mapuche, the descendants of the Araucans that resisted Spanish rule, they were left in the lurch. And it's an irony because what I know from my parents, they were historians in Spanish American history. By the time of independence, usually the Indians, the Native Americans, sided with the king because he protected them from these merchant, these classes of Spanish descendants that they wanted to take over their lands. Well, supposedly the king was protecting them because they were subjects of the king equally like the others, like the Spaniards. But the descendants of the Spaniards wanted to get more and more and more and more at their expense. They became independent, then they took over as much as they could. I am talking now about the Indians, the Native Americans, and you can picture that of keeping a social strata, a social structure like the wouldn't change, like in Bolivia. In Bolivia, I heard that Indians Native Americans dress typically, they wouldn't be allowed to banks before Evo Morales came to power. They wouldn't be allowed to banks in the capital La Paz because of the way they were dressed. There were that kind of discrimination. So that's a problem that I think is linked to the social, to the political high classes. How can you change that? Well, it's going to be tough after about 200 years of privilege and domination, really.
Danny Shaw, let's talk about the economic fallout from the crisis in Chile. The peso is at an all-time low now. The government says that the damage caused by weeks of unrest has surpassed $1 billion US. Time is of the essence here for Santiago to do something substantial.
Yeah, and it's important to remember who is at the helm of this, who's at the top of the social pyramid. It's the Sebastián Piñeras and the other filthy rich in Santiago, across Chile. Piñera is worth some $3 billion, a number very close to what Trump is worth. And that's where the economic and social problems emanate from, such a deeply unequal system. And I think it's important to highlight, too, that every day the U.S. media highlights the protests in Hong Kong, but not a word about Santiago de Chile, not a word about Port-au-Prince, Haiti, not a word about Quito, Ecuador. So just this double standard in terms of how the international media, the mainstream media, treats different countries. And my colleague in San Juan very correctly pointed out this sharp racial and class divide that characterizes the history of Latin America. And we see the people on the rise, marginalized people, the indigenous, the forgotten, spat upon sectors of society, personalized in Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in Bolivia. Of course, Hugo Chavez had African and indigenous mixed roots, and Nicolás Maduro there. As we speak right now, there is un encuentro anti-imperialista in Havana, Cuba, an anti-imperialist Congress, where the leadership from across the continent is meeting to continue these broad social struggles.
Right, Lau Sazi, the fallout has not just been on the economic spectrum. It's had political fallout as well, as two international summits due to be held in Santiago have been canceled due to the protests. The country's tourism sector has also taken a battering. How do you view the decision to cancel these two important summits?
Well, I'm sure that correctly they saw that if they would hold these summits, the protesters, not necessarily the mass of people that are in need, that are suffering these inequalities, but probably radicals. No, I mentioned the anarchists, others that are anti-system. They would take advantage of the situation to rally support, to try to blockade or damage the image of Chile as a business-friendly country because it's peaceful, etc. So they decided to cancel them just to avoid a disaster in public relations. That would have happened if they would have held these meetings, these summits. But I suppose that what Piñera, that's my opinion, would have to do is to try to sit down with social leaders and then try to economists, but not just neoliberal ones, and try to share that wealth to end those privileges that keep other Chileans to ascend socially, economically. That's my opinion. But for instance, Professor Shaw mentioned correctly the population of Chile is like 18 million. I believe that according to the CIA World Factbook, the Netherlands has a population similar, less than Chile, but around 18 million or so. Obviously, there are big differences geographically, but the GDP of the Netherlands is over 900 billion. dollars. That of Chile is about half, 450 billion. The amount of irrigated land of the Netherlands is over 4,000 square kilometers. The amount of irrigated land of Chile is 11,100 kilometers. Obviously, the Dutch have gas and oil. But Chile doesn't, but Chile has a lot of potential. They can increase the opportunities for the people so that they can improve their lives. And if that means for the state to spend more money, for instance, for their resources, for the mining of copper and other resources, they should do it, because this is a ticking bomb. This is a time bomb. I'm sure they don't want a full-scale revolution, bloody, violent. If they don't do something about it, it's going to happen eventually. And of course, the example is going to be taken by other countries, the people of those desperate masses that see that there is no change whatsoever to their situation.
And one last question for you, Mr. Shaw. There are somewhat similar demonstrations in other Latin American countries you did allude to. Are they riding a wave together, or are they separate cases in your opinion?
No, unquestionably, Ecuador inspires Chile, and Chile inspires Argentina, and Argentina inspires Colombia. And I think López Obrador, the president of Mexico, said it best that, you know, this time bomb that Mr. Sarzi is talking about in Chile, this was 5 decades in the making. Since the overthrow of this peaceful socialist Allende project in 1973, people are fed up and they're going to continue to fight back. And what Sebastián Piñera and the Billionaires Boys Club has tried to present is this image, this mirage of Chile as this oasis, as this classic example of the success of neoliberalism and capitalism, and the lid has been blown off of that, and the truth is out that the Chicago Boys model and Milton Friedman, that free trade is nothing more than free foxes running among free chickens. In other words, that the people never had a way to defend themselves against these aggressive, predatory policies of capitalism.
All right, we're fresh out of time. Allow me to thank my guests, freelance journalist and political commentator and Latin American expert, Mr. Laho Sazdi, joining us from San Juan, also professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York, Danny Shaw, joining us from New York. Thank you for contributing to the program, and also special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying with us on tonight's debate. Good night, everybody.